So as Chris said, I'm the other Ashley, the other Ashley H. And yeah, I focus on rangeland management and animal science in Gila and Pinal County. So I have the pleasure of spending a lot of time on the ground with ranchers across the Tonto. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit today. Do you want to just give kind of a quick intro to plant life forms, kind of how they play their role in the environment, talk about some of the things that I've seen since I've been here. I came into this position in August of 2016, so I have a couple of years now on the ground in Gila County. I'm not from Gila County, but I love working here and working with everyone. So just kind of talk about some of those things I've seen on the ground, especially the precipitation-driven cycles and changes of vegetation, the invasive species that we have going on that Dr. Latta talked about yesterday. And then I do have some current data that shows some of the initial recovery from the fire on some long-term monitoring sites where we have multiple years of data. And I've recently gone back out to those sites since the fire and been able to kind of document the changes in the recovery that's going on. And so this picture right here, that was El Capitan. The picture on the left is July, and the picture on the right, that was just last Friday. I was there at the monitoring site, and it's kind of hard to see, but things are sprouting, and then some of the oak species, they are slowly coming back. I think Dr. Latta alluded to this yesterday. It might take a little bit, but from what I've seen so far in some of the more moderate burned areas, I'm slightly optimistic about what's going to happen. Just so we can kind of understand how things will respond to fire and what's driving some of these fires, just some basic botany principles is there's main groups that we call plant life forms. So we have grasses and grass-like species. Those can either be annual, which means they complete their life cycle in one growing season, so they will grow, go to seed, and die. And then obviously we have perennial species, which are more long-lived on the landscape. And then we can also break that down further between warm and cool season species. So some species will grow during the spring, some will grow in the summer. We have forms, which can be annual, biennial, which means they live two growing seasons. So the first growing season, they'll usually just put out leaves. The second growing season is when they will flower, go to seed, and then die. And then again, perennial, and then again, warm and cool season. And then of course we have shrubs and trees, which are going to be long-lived perennials, and they can either be evergreen or deciduous, meaning they will drop their leaves in the winter when it gets cooler. And so having all of these components on the landscape, really we want all of these things, right? We want a nice diverse rangeland that has a nice mix of all of our cool season, warm season, annuals, perennials, biennials, across all of these life forms. And so as Dr. Latta mentioned yesterday, the annual species, unfortunately, in this case, is really what's driving a lot of the big fires we've had in the last couple of years, the bush, woodbury, and the Telegraph Fire. And so as you would imagine, these things will fluctuate greatly with precipitation. I mean, we have seen that this year, the native annual warm season grasses that are coming up right now after the Telegraph Fire, I don't think I've ever seen some of those grasses that big as I have this year. My mind has just been blown away when I've been out monitoring this season, just seeing the sheer volume of those annual grasses. And so Dr. Latta mentioned yesterday, a lot of times these serve as the fine fuels that are carrying the fire. You can kind of look at this time series of photos. So this is the same location across several years. So the top right was about 2006. Then you can see the next photo, they did a juniper treatment in that area in about 2010. The next bottom left was 2019. And then this, the last one was just this week. That was taken on Wednesday. And it's kind of hard to see, but the last photo in 2019 compared to now, The 2019 photo, all of the grass that you can see in that photo is all of the perennial species. They're a little short because this pasture was used by livestock, so it had been grazed. But you can see in the most recent photo from Wednesday, all of that prominent vegetation right there is all mostly annual species. There's still perennial species that are healthy and thriving in that photo, but the annuals are really what's dominating the landscape right now. And so you can just see in those 4 photos how easily those annuals can change to provide additional fuel. So I've had a lot of folks ask me recently, seeing all of the grass come up after the Telegraph Fire, if our low deserts are converting to a grassland. And the answer is just no. So I think seeing all the grass that came up is a little misleading because it is annual. So if you don't know the difference between annual and perennial vegetation and what's going on, you might think that our desert scrub is converting to a grassland, but like I said, it's not. So the precipitation just cannot handle or can't support a grassland at this low desert. So all of the grass that you're seeing, I'm sure you've noticed now, it's starting to die, turn gold, and eventually it will be removed from the landscape at some point through either wind, water, some type of erosion. So I think that's one thing to mention. Again, like I said, I've been getting a lot of folks asking me what's going on after the fire. Are we going to have a nice grassland in the desert now? And yeah, it would be lovely. I love a good grassland, but yeah, it's just not possible because of the precipitation zone that we are in. Going back to the invasive species and fire that was mentioned yesterday, so this map right here, these are all of the long-term monitoring sites across the Tonto, where myself or my predecessor has been collecting data since the mid-2000s. There are some gaps. The gaps are mostly wilderness areas that are extremely difficult to access, or areas where there's not active grazing. So that's kind of why there's a little bit of a chunk of area that does not have monitoring locations. Obviously, these are more accessible areas where livestock grazing is occurring. On over half of those locations, red brome has been documented. So there's 458 sites across the Tonto that do have long-term data, and I think it was 279 of those sites have documented red brome. So that's probably our most prolific invasive species in Gila County by far. And then this map right here, this is sites that have more than 50% frequency. So frequency is just presence or absence. So these are sites where red brome had a frequency of 50%, which is fairly high for a species. And so you can kind of see, unfortunately, a lot of those sites are in this Globe Miami area, especially down by Superior and where the Woodbury and Telegraph Fire started. Those are some of the densest areas of red brome that I've seen across the whole forest. Yesterday, it was stinkgrass, or sorry, Mary didn't mention stinkgrass yesterday. She mentioned the Mediterranean grass or the schismus. So those are 2 other annual invasive species. They're not as prolific. I only see them at maybe 20%, 30% of the sites. And then the last 2 on that list, yellow bluestem and stinknet, are 2 that are very new to the county and that are kind of concerning to me. I've talked to Adam a little bit about it and some of the folks on other districts on the Tonto about these species because of their introduction and their potential to increase the fuels for fire.
Question.
Oh, yeah.
Is El Capitan considered a desert?
I would consider it like a chaparral desert. It's kind of on that like weird cusp, to be honest, of like I would consider it a transition zone because it is kind of a mix of that interior chaparral and desert scrub. I did put together 2 fact sheets that are on the back table about yellow bluestem and stinknet. Stinknet is very, very new. I would say within the last 2 years. I've had people tell me they've seen it in some of the canyons coming off the Pinal Mountains. And then yellow bluestem is really taking a foothold more in the young area, but in some of the monitoring locations I have in the Apache Mountains, just outside of Globe, we have documented yellow bluestem a few times. And so that top picture is a snake net, and that's actually over by, it's on Cave Creek. They're doing that restoration project by the Salt River. Is it Granite Dam or something like that? Granite Reef, yes. So that picture was taken by a colleague of mine at Granite Creek. All of that yellow is the stink net. And so the real issue is that we don't have an annual forb like stink net that gets that big and grows in that density. A lot of our annual forbs really only put out, a few stems, get maybe this tall. I guess this year I have seen some sunflower that's been almost as tall as me, but that's kind of, again, an off year, precipitation driven. So the issue with stink net is it's going to outcompete our native forbs that are annual during the warm season, and then it's just going to create a monoculture, or an area where nothing but the stink net is going to grow. And as you can see in that picture, if you put a flame to that, I'm sure that that would carry fire just as well as red brome would. That bottom picture was taken in young. All of that grass in that picture, and then as far as the eye can see, is all yellow blue stem. And so some of that, some of the first pictures that I showed on one of the previous slides when I was showing the differences in annual grasses, that was also taken in young. So in that photo, you can see that the native rangelands that have like side oats grama, blue grama, hairy grama, those areas have still interspaces in between the plants, which is natural. The problem with the yellow blue stem is it grows, again, in a very thick monoculture where it's outcompeting our native grasses and nothing's going to grow in its place. There's some research that shows that yellow blue stem can actually alter chemicals within the soil that makes it inhospitable for other native grasses to germinate. And so looking at that picture, you can see, again, imagine if that catches on fire. That's going to be a huge fuel load that our native grasses wouldn't ever produce that much biomass. And so every time I get a chance, I like to talk to people about what they can do. So I'm going to take a quick sidestep to just bend your ear. I used to work for Fish and Wildlife Service, and I was an invasive species coordinator for all of the refuges in Arizona. So I spent a lot of time treating invasive species and also interacting with the public that came onto the refuges to educate them. And so especially now what I'm seeing, I just was at Banyang on Tuesday and Wednesday, driving up the South Road from Globe, yellow blue stem is periodically just popping up along the road. So one thing I like to tell people is your vehicle, your trailer, your ATV, UTV, however you're getting around, is a huge vector for spreading seeds of invasive species. So I always try to encourage folks, if you're going from one area to another, try and wash off your tires or underneath your vehicle, because you don't really think about the seeds that could have been caught up in your vehicle. Even with boots, if you have boots that have some mesh, seeds can get stuck in your boots. So think about cleaning off your boots if you're going to a new area or after you leave an area. A lot of folks, if you are a rancher and you have to pack in with your animals somewhere, always try to purchase certified weed-free hay, so you're not, again, taking an unknown species into the wilderness or somewhere that you could potentially introduce a new species. So as a landowner in Globe, I would encourage folks to keep an eye out for these species growing in your yard. And if you see them, pull them, bag them, remove them. That way your home and your vehicle is not becoming a vector to spread the invasive species potentially onto the forest or anywhere else that you might be traveling. So on the two fact sheets that I have in the back, have quite a few pictures and ways to identify both the stink net and the yellow blue stem. So again, if you don't mind, I would encourage you to look at those and just keep an eye on your property and what's going on. This just kind of goes back to what Adam mentioned first thing this morning is what do we do about the invasive species? So unfortunately, with the red brome, it is kind of past the point of no return. It's also an annual, so it's extremely hard to treat. Most herbicides are selected for perennial species. The only type of herbicide you could use would be some sort of pre-emergent, where you would spray before it germinates in the spring. But obviously, treating the Tonto, that's millions of acres, that's a lot of money that just, it's pretty much impossible to treat an invasive species like red brome that's annual. So we really just need to be aware of the fact that, unfortunately, with red brome being introduced into the landscape, we're going to have to just kind of get used to these fire intervals, especially when we have a wet year like this last year. I was in Superior, very near Telegraph Canyon, where the fires, very near where the fire started in March, doing some monitoring, and the red brome was up to my knee. And since 2016, working on this forest, I've never seen red brome that big. So I unfortunately don't have an answer as to what we could do to move forward when it comes to invasive species like that are going to be driving the fire. I just think we need to be more fire wise and really pay attention to what's going on. As far as new species like the sneaknet and the yellow bluestem, we're kind of at the cusp of, we might still be able to do something to potentially eradicate those species, or at least control them before they get out of hand, which again is why I'm bringing these up, so that more people are just aware of these species that are new to the county, and just be aware that we really need to try and get on top of them before they become a red brome issue, where it's past the point of no return and there's really nothing we can do. The two that I wanted to mention about the yellow bluestem is that it does look nice. Sure, there's a lot of biomass there, but cattle don't like it, wildlife don't like it. They don't want to eat it. It's too thick. If you've ever seen the plant, it is very thick. It's not palatable. And there's also research that shows it decreases biodiversity of birds and insects and other wildlife in areas where it's becoming a monoculture like this. So it might look nice, and you might think, oh yeah, that's just forage for, this is a big ranching community. It's not even good for wildlife, like I said. So again, just being aware, also letting other folks know about these invasive species and what they could potentially do to stop their spread. Okay. Yes.
So a question from Sam Ralston online is, he asked if when red brome burns, does it kill the seed?
It does not kill the seed. It is fire adapted. It's one of those things that's from Africa, where it's like most of our invasive species in Arizona, unfortunately, are from Africa, where they are used to a fire season. So buffalo grass is another big one, especially down by Tucson, and that is very fire adapted. In fact, it loves fire, and red brome's kind of the same way. The fire is not going to have an impact on it. It's from an area where it's used to fire. So yeah. So I'm just going to kind of change gears a little bit and talk about some of the vegetation recovery that I've seen so far. So this is El Capitan area. You can kind of see this is the 77 where it meets the 60 just outside of Globe. And so this was a site, a long-term monitoring site we have that was in a moderate intensity area. And these aren't all of the species that grow on this site. These are just some of the more important perennial species that are important for wildlife and cattle. So the numbers are probably very small, but basically the good news is that so those top 5 species are perennial grasses, and so over time, this is looking at frequency, and so over time the frequency really hasn't changed, and even post-fire the frequency has only decreased slightly, which you would expect. A few plants are going to die and not survive the fire. especially coming out of the severe drought we were just in, I was expecting there to be a lot more stressed plants that did not survive the fire, but when I've been out there, I've been pleasantly surprised. So just looking at the second one down is Cyrus grama. So before the fire, the frequency was 15%, and now after the fire, the frequency is 11%. So there has been a slight decrease, but again, you would expect a few. Going down, so the Turbinella oak, pre-fire, the frequency was about 18%, and now the frequency is 4%, which is to be expected. Obviously, a lot of that oak burned during the fire, but it's slowly resprouting and coming back. Also, we have fairy duster, which is really common around here. It's one of the more pretty smaller subshrubs. It's got a really big pink flower if you've ever seen it. Again, so pre-fire, the frequency was 48%, and now it's at 47%. So again, another slight decrease, which is to be expected. What's really interesting is that, so this site has pretty much always been monitored in October, November. Pre-fire, this site didn't have very much red brome, so it was about 1 to 3% frequency across the years. After the fire, it was 0% because it's all burned. So the next one after red brome is spurge, which is an annual forb. It's really low growing. It provides a lot of ground cover. Pre-fire, 14%. Post-fire, 5%. And then this last line is Indian wheat, which is another annual forb. And this is kind of a really good example of those fluctuations over time. So it went from about 51%, 45%, 0%, 2%, 42%, 5%, and 0%. So you can see that that's really fluctuating again with precipitation over time. No, these are not invasive species, sorry. These are native, a mix of native species that are, there's one actually, there's Layman's lovegrass is the only invasive species, and red brome. Those are the only two invasive species on this list. And then unfortunately at this site, we have seen an increase in invasive species, the Layman's lovegrass after the fire, which again is another African introduced species that really thrives on fire. Yesterday, Kelly was kind of talking about ground cover and what's going on. So as part of my protocols of the data that I'm collecting, we're also looking at different ground cover. So you can see here, the top line is bare soil. So we went from about 2% bare soil in 2015 to 28% bare soil after the fire. The gravel component's not going to change. The good thing is that there is litter on the ground. So the litter has stayed about the same. So in 2015, it was 17%, and then this year it was 15%. So litter is really good. I think Kelly mentioned it yesterday. Litter, gravel, rock, the persistent litter, those are all things that we want to see because that's going to protect the ground from raindrops, and kind of the more of the ground cover you have, the better off you are, because it's going to provide something that's going to slow down that rainfall impact, and you'll have hopefully less erosion. So the persistent litter, we look at two different categories of litter. So the basic litter is very small, fine things like a blade of grass, a dead annual species, something that's going to be easily removed from the site through wind or rain. The other litter category is persistent litter. And so that is like a dead stick, a chunk of dead cactus, animal droppings, something that's going to take longer to decompose over time and that will most likely stay on the site a little bit longer. So the one thing we did see was that there was a pretty big decrease in persistent litter at this site. So those things that I just mentioned were probably all burned during the fire. So this is that site, and you can just kind of see how vegetation has changed over time. So we go from 2019 to October this year. Obviously, the oak is gone, some of that bare grass is gone, but the good news is there's a lot of perennial grasses at this site that are coming up, that are recovering from the fire, that you can see in the photo, and it almost, without the oak, it almost looks a little bit better than it did in 2018, the last time that we had monitored right before the fire. So this is a site that's kind of on the boundary of moderate to light burn, also in the El Capitan area. And again, everything is recovering slowly. The very interesting thing about this site is it did have a lot more red brome. So you can see in 2013, it had 87% red brome frequency. And then again, right after the fire, it's down to 0 because it's all burned. And then at this site, the other thing to note is that Lehman's lovegrass, the invasive, is also slightly is increasing over time. But the good thing is that the native species that are there are also recovering nicely right after the fire. And then again, this is just looking at ground cover at this site. The bare soil really didn't increase as much. So in 2012, the bare soil was 12%. Again, this year it was 12%. So that tells me, even though we've had the fire, the good news is that the bare soil hasn't increased significantly. I have been really pleasantly surprised at what's been going on. I was a total pessimist and thought it was going to look a lot worse out there than it did. So I'm glad to see that bare soil component did not take a significant jump. And again, there's a lot of litter, gravel, holding some of those things in place. So this is just the photos. I'm almost done. So then, and this was at this site, that was July of this year, right after the fire. And then here's October. So you can see there's been a lot of growth. Some of it is a lot of the annual species that are native, but again, there was a lot of perennial species growth going on at the site. And then here's an example from the Woodbury fire recovery. So this site was actually just right down the road from where the fire had started. And you can see again, we had been there in 2019 and we went back in 2020 after the fire. And again, all of the species are coming back nicely. But here's another concerning issue with red brome. In 2020, red brome was at 62% frequency. So this is a perfect example of the fire went through. The fire had no effect on brome and the seed bank. It was still there, unfortunately. So again, it's just something we're going to have to get used to and just think about going forward. Here's just the ground cover after the fire at this Woodbury site. And again, everything's coming back nicely. There wasn't a huge jump in bare soil. The bare soil actually decreased slightly from pre-fire. And then I think my last slide is just the photo series of the Woodbury site right before it burned, and then leading up to the burn, and then afterwards. If there's any other questions, please feel free to contact me, shoot me an email, or I'll be around all day. Yes, Kathy.
So you were talking about the yellow blue stem, which is the grasses that's growing in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Is the only way to get rid of that with pre-emergent, or is it fire resistance, even fire against?
Yeah, so the yellow blue stem, since it's perennial, you can treat it with herbicide. There's actually research that's been done that there's out of Texas that showed that there's like 5 herbicides that worked best with it. I think glyphosate and imazapyr were the top 2. That study, though, unfortunately found that you had a better chance of eradicating the yellow-blue stem if you did a combination of mowing then treating with herbicide. Obviously, the study found that you could treat with just herbicide alone and it would still work, but the most efficient route was mowing and then herbicide treatment.
Okay, well, thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks.